Now let's look at what is functions in Java. So any block of code which can perform a specific task can be called a function in Java. Functions are also known as methods. And if you remember, we came across a method which is the main method from where the execution begins for every program. So main method is also a function which performs a specific task, which is to start the execution of your program. Similarly, you can write your own function. So it helps us to organize our code. Basically, we create different blocks of code, which we call functions, and then we can call those functions anywhere in our code. So this is the reusable part of your code, which you form a function. So for example, take an example of any application. So every application has a login page. Now, login page has different tasks, like you can enter the username, the password, and then you click on login. It takes you to the home page. So all of these tasks can be formed into a single function, which is called the login function. And then you can make it reusable and use it anywhere in your code where you want to call this login function. So as I said, functions helps us to define a task and reuse it throughout our code. So let's take a sample task. Now we want to get instructions for driving a car. So the steps would be to insert the car keys, start the engine, and press the accelerator. So these are the different steps through which you can perform a specific task like driving a car. So we can put all of these steps into a single task or function, which will be get instructions for driving a car. So how do you define a function? Now we can take the example of getting instructions for driving a car, and we can use that task name as our function name. So all the steps inside the task will form a function, and we can define a function like we can mention it public void and then the function name followed by parenthesis and then the curly braces. So inside the curly braces is the block of code which will execute this function. So this will all your steps which will form your function, right? So public, it makes it public throughout your code. You can access it anywhere. And void means it will not return any value. Okay. Now, how do you call a function? So calling a function is pretty simple. You just enter the name of the function followed by parentheses, and your function will be called anywhere inside your code, and it will execute all the steps inside that function. So let's now see with the help of a real example where we'll create a class, we'll create a function to get instructions for driving a car, and then we'll use this reusable function somewhere else in our code. Let's use this car class which we created earlier in some of our sessions. So in this, we are going to create a new function which is for getting instructions for driving a car. So let's go ahead and create a function. So this function will be inside the same class and it will be after your any other method. So it will be completely separate, not inside the main method, right? So create a function here. So type public void get instructions for driving a car. So this is our function name. This is the return type void. That means it doesn't return anything. And public is the access identifier, which makes it accessible throughout this class. Okay, now followed by parentheses and then the block of code. So inside this, let's write some print statements. So system.out.println So our first step is to, we'll say step 1 is insert the car keys, and then we'll again say system.out.println, and our step 2 is start the engine. Again, another step. So here we will say press the accelerator, and these are our 3 steps. Okay, so this is, all of these steps are inside a function, and as you can see it is grayed out right now because this method is never used. Okay, so now let's go into the void main, and here what we are going to do is we are going to call this function. So we'll use the same name as the function name. So get instructions for driving a car, followed by parentheses and semicolon. So it is complaining that it's a non-static method, and since void main is a static method, we need to define it as static. Okay, so we'll see later on what is static and what is non-static methods, but let's now just keep it static so that the error goes away. Now, as you can see, this is the function call. So at this point, the function will be called and all the statements will be executed. So let's go ahead and execute this class. So right click, run car.main, and let's see the console now, right? So once all the other statements are executed inside the main method, our function gets called and all the steps inside the function are executed. So step 1, step 2, and step 3. So this is how you create a function with all the different steps, and then you call a function inside your main method or anywhere inside your class. Next, we will talk about what are function parameters, how you can pass them, and what are the different types of function parameters. Now let's understand what are function parameters and how we can use them. So for that, let's consider a function which adds two numbers. So these are our two numbers, num1 equals to 5 and num2 equals to 3. So our function has two steps. The first is to add the numbers and store it in a result variable. And the second step is to print the result variable. So whenever you call this function, it will always print the same output, which is 8, because we have these static variables num1 and num2, which were always have the same value, which is 5 and 3. Now, what if I want to add different numbers by using this same function? So in this way, it's not possible, but it is possible by defining different inputs inside the function. So let's see how we can use parameters with functions. So our num1 and num2 are the inputs which we require in order to add two numbers. And then we can define these inputs inside our function definition. Okay, so earlier we did not had anything in the function definition, we just had the function name. But now we are going to have two inputs in our function definition, and these inputs are called parameters. Value of these inputs will be assigned when the function is called. And the same function can be used multiple times for different set of inputs, because we are just setting the definition that these are our inputs, but we are not assigning any value in the definition. So that will be done when you call the function. As you can see, we can call our function multiple times with different inputs, 2, 3, 4 comma 5, and this will generate different output, right? So now let's see how we can use a class to define a function to add two numbers with different parameters, and how we can use it to add different set of numbers using the same function. So we are going to use the calculator class which we created earlier in order to create a function with two parameters. So let's have a look what is inside this class. So we have different statements to perform mathematical calculations like addition, multiplication, subtraction, and we are going to use the addition statements, right? So we are going to create a function which can add two numbers. So let's do that. This will be created outside the main function, and we'll start with public static void, and we'll keep the function name as add numbers. And let's create the block. Inside this, we need to write the code to add two numbers. And this will be exactly what we have written earlier. So let's copy and paste these two lines of code. The first line is to add two numbers and then to print the result. So adding these two numbers, right now, these two numbers are not declared, right? So we need to pass these two numbers into the function as inputs or parameters. So we need to pass it with the data type. So int num1 and int num2, right? Now you'll see the error goes away. Now this parameters, it acts as a declaration also for the two variables. And once they are declared, you can use them inside the function, right? Now, whenever we call this function anywhere in the code, you need to pass these two values with the same data type, right? So if they are int, you need to pass two numbers in order to run this function. So let's see how we can do that. So we are going to call that function inside the main function. So let's type add numbers, and you will see it will straight away tell you that it is accepting two numbers with int data type, right? So let's specify that. We'll specify 3 comma 4, and we'll do it again to add different numbers like 5 comma 4. So now as you can see, I can use the same function to add different numbers. So let's go ahead and run this. So right click and select run calculator.main, and in the output you will see it is showing addition of two numbers, which is the first result is 7 and the second result is 9, right? So this is how you can define a function with different parameters and also call that function by passing the required values into the parameters. Now let's talk about function return types. Until now, we have been using a void return type, which means we have not been returning any value from our functions or any output from our functions. But what if there is a scenario where we have to use the output of a function to perform some other actions? Like if there is an add function which is adding two numbers and I want to use that output to multiply with another number. Now, how can we do that, right? So we can do it by returning the output in the function itself. And then when we are calling that function, we can get that output, store it in a variable, and then use it accordingly wherever we want to use it, right? So this is done with the help of return statements in function. So return is a reserved keyword in Java, which is used to exit from a function with or without a value, right? So we can either return a value like 0, or we can return a value with actual output. Like in the add function, we can actually return the sum of two numbers, right? And that will be stored in a variable called sum. Okay. Now that we can use that in any other function or anywhere where we are calling this particular function. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, functions with void return types will not have any return statements. Okay. So we don't need to specify any return statements if we are using a void return type in our function definition. Okay. So Let's now see with an example how we can actually implement this return types in our functions. Now let's use the same function add numbers which we created in our earlier section under the calculator class. So it has two parameters, and if you notice we had defined in the definition that it's a void function, which means it doesn't return any value, right? So this is the void return type. Now if you want to change it, we need to change it according to the data type of our output, right? So our output is of int data type. Similarly, if you want to return this value, you need to make this a int return type. So your return type depends on the output what you are generating in that function, right? And what you want to return in that function. The same data type should be used in the definition also. So this will be a int return type. Similarly, if you are returning a string, it will be a string return type. Got it? Now, as you will see, once you change the return type, the function is now expecting that you are going to write a return statement. Otherwise, it will show that you are missing a return statement, right? So let's type a return, and then here we will say simply that we are returning the add values. Okay, so we are returning the add, which is the output of two numbers being added, right? So when you call this function, you need to get the output and store it in a variable. So in this main function, what we'll do is we will create int, and we can write int s equals to add numbers of 2 comma 3, right? So what this is going to do is it's going to store the output which is being returned from this function into this variable, which is s. Okay, now if you want to perform any other calculation on this particular number, so we can do that. So let's print it out. So we will say s, and we will say multiply that into 3. Okay, so you can also store it in a variable and thus just print the variable, but you can also do it inside the println method, right? So what I'm doing, I'm adding two numbers 2 comma 3, storing it in a variable output which is returned by this function into s, and then I am performing another calculation which is multiplying the output with 3 and then printing that output, right? So this is how you call a function which has got a return type. So you store it in the same variable with the same return type, and then perform any action on the variable which contains the output. So let's go ahead and run this class now. So right click and select run calculator.main, and now you will see, so this is the print statement from the function which is adding the two numbers 2 comma 3, which is 5, and you will see in the print statement we have multiplied that with 3, so the output should be 15, and this is our output. So this is how you define a function with a return type, and also you can call that function with the return value and perform some action on the same. So next we will talk about some of the built-in functions which are available in Java. Now let's talk about built-in functions in Java. So until now, we have been creating many functions which are user defined, because we are defining the code which is written inside that function, and we are also calling those functions in our code, right? So all of these are defined by us. But Java also provides a library which contains lots of or thousands of functions which are readily available for you to use. And all of these functions are known as built-in functions because they are already predefined inside the Java library. Now, in order to call a particular built-in function, you can just call it with their name and the parameters which it accepts. So you can use the dot operator to get access to all the built-in functions which are present inside a package or inside a class, right? Now, one of the most commonly used built-in function is the system.out.println. And if you have noticed throughout my programs, I have used this built-in function to print different statements onto the console. Similarly, there are different string methods which are already defined in the string class of the Java library. So we can use different string methods once we create an object of the string class, which we have already done. So we used so many methods of the string class, like we used the two uppercase, two lowercase, the length, and the equals method to compare two strings. So there are hundreds of methods which are available in the string class, and you can easily make use of it without writing a single piece of code. So that's the benefit of having built-in functions.